The contract hit the store counter hard enough to rattle the jar of penny candy near the register. Gretchen Mueller heard the sound from where she stood at the far end of the porch, and her hands went still inside her apron. She did not go in right away. She stood in the January cold, with her breath making small clouds in front of her face, and she counted the boards on the porch railing the way she always did when she needed a moment to steady herself. 14 boards. She had counted them 100 times. Inside, the voices rose. She could not make out the words through the warped glass of the window, but she knew the shape of what was happening. She had known since the night before when she had come downstairs for a cup of water and heard her Uncle Clem talking low and fast in the kitchen with a man she did not recognize. She had stood in the dark hallway with her bare feet on the cold floor and listened, and what she heard made her press her back flat against the wall and close her eyes. 40 acres. Her name, a number she had not been able to unhear since. Now the January light was flat and white over the main street of Oakhaven, and the sound of boots on the wooden floor inside told her at least 4 men had gathered. She pressed her palm against the rough siding of the wall and took one breath, then another. Her left foot ached the way it always did in hard cold, a dull throb from the old fever that had never fully let go of the bone. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The warmth hit her first, then the smell, wood smoke, and tobacco, and the sharp bite of whiskey someone had already opened before noon. 4 men stood at the counter, her Uncle Clem, old Amos Briggs, who owned the land along Kettle Creek, and whose reputation in Oakhaven ran about as warm as the creek did in February. The sheriff Carl Hodge, hat in hand, looking at the floor, and a 4th man she did not know standing in the shadow near the dry goods shelves with his hat pulled low. Amos Briggs was already looking at her. He had a way of looking at a person that made you feel you had been measured and found useful, the way a man looks at a draft animal he is considering purchasing. He let his eyes move over her slowly, and she felt the familiar pull to drop her chin, to look at her own shoes to disappear. "There she is," Amos said. His voice was the color of old leather, cracked and pleased with itself. "Bring her over here, Clem. Let me have a proper look." Her uncle did not hesitate. He crossed the floor and took her by the elbow, and the grip of his fingers was the same grip she had known her whole life, firm enough to remind her that she had no say in this. She went where he directed her. She kept her eyes on the middle distance, past Amos's shoulder, past the row of canned goods on the shelf behind him. Her hands disappeared into her apron. Amos reached out and put his thick fingers around her upper arm, squeezing once the way you test a melon at market. "Stout-built," he said. "That's what I wanted, stout-built and quiet." He laughed at something only he found funny, and one of the other men near the door made a sound that was almost a laugh. From the far corner of the store, from the shadow near the dry goods, the 4th man had not moved, had not made a sound. But Gretchen felt his eyes on her the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive, a pressure shift, a stillness in the air that means something is coming. She did not look at him. She kept her gaze fixed on the middle distance and breathed through her nose and waited for whatever came next. She had been waiting her whole life. She was practiced at it. But she had not been standing in front of Amos Briggs's satisfaction on a January morning by accident. To understand how she had come to be here, how a woman of 26, with flowers still dusted at her wrist, had ended up at the center of a bargain she had never agreed to, you would have to go back to that same morning before the sun had cleared the ridge, when she had been alone in the kitchen and the house had been quiet, and she had believed the way she always believed on mornings like that today might be different. It was not different. It was in fact the last morning of the life she had always known. She had been up since before 4. The kitchen was cold when she came downstairs, cold enough that she could see her breath, and she had built the fire in the cook-stove from the coals she had banked the night before, coaxing them back to life with a few shavings of pine and a patience she had learned early. The Muller house was a 3-room affair on the east edge of Oakhaven, not much to look at from the road, its paint gone gray and its roof patched twice with tin that did not quite match. Gretchen had lived in it her whole life. It had been her parents' house before the fever took them both in the same hard winter when she was 9, and it had been her uncle Clement Muller's house since then. Clem was her father's younger brother. He had taken her in because there was no one else, and he had reminded her of that fact with some regularity over the 17 years since. She tied her apron and measured out the flour by feel in the dark, her hands moving in the familiar way they always moved in a kitchen, certain and quiet. She had 6 pounds of plums she had dried herself in September, spread on screens in the lean-to, and turned every day for 2 weeks until they came out dark and sticky and dense with their own sweetness. She had been saving them. She added the last of the sugar, which was not much, and set the pot to heat. The jam had to be done before Clem was up. He did not like to see her working when he was awake. He said it made the house smell of effort, and effort, in Clem's accounting of the world, was something other people did. She worked in the gray dark, and listened to the house creak in the wind off the ridge, and she let herself think just for a little while about what she would do with the jars once they were set. She had 11 empty jars lined up on the shelf, and if the plums held, and the sugar was enough to set them right, she would have 11 jars of preserves for the winter, enough to trade at Pettifer's store for a sack of cornmeal and maybe a paper of pins, enough to make herself useful in a way that required no argument. She was always trying to make herself useful in ways that required no argument. By the time the plums were soft and the kitchen smelled of sugar and something warm, the sky had gone from black to the color of a bruise, and she could see the frost on the inside of the window glass beginning to melt at the edges. She ladled the jam carefully into the jars, each one in turn, wiping the rims with a clean cloth. Her hands were red from the heat and the cold both. She did not mind. She set the jars in a row on the window-sill to cool, and stood back and looked at them, and let herself feel just for a moment that she had done something worth doing. The back door opened and Clem came in without knocking, which was not unusual, since it was his own house. He looked at the jars. He looked at the dusting of flour on the floor that she had not yet swept. He looked at her with the expression she knew well, the one that started from a place of general irritation and moved, depending on his mood, to either dismissal or something worse. "You're wasting the sugar," he said. There was barely a 1/4 pound left, she said. It would have gone hard before spring. "Don't argue with me in my own kitchen." She did not argue. She turned back to the stove and checked the fire, because the fire needed checking, and because it gave her something to look at. That was not his face. Clem pulled his coat off the hook and shrugged into it. He was a lean man, thin in the way that hard winters make a person thin, with a face that had settled into lines of permanent complaint somewhere around his 40th year. He had never married. He had never, as far as Gretchen could tell, wanted anything that he had, only things he did not have. "Amos Briggs is coming to the store this morning," Clem said. He said it to her back to the room, not quite to her directly. She kept her eyes on the stove. "I heard you say his name last night." A pause. "You were up." "I came down for water." He was quiet for a moment, and she heard him pull out the chair and sit, and the familiar creak of it under his weight. "Amos has land along Kettle Creek. 40 acres, good bottom land, black soil. He needs a woman to run the house. He's willing to trade the deed." The ladle in her hand was very still. "I'm 26 years old," she said. "Which is why he'll take you," Clem said, and there was something in his voice that was almost apologetic, or would have been apologetic on a different man. Nobody else is asking Gretchen. You know that. She did know that. She had known it for some years. In Oakhaven, a woman of 26 who had not married was a thing people mentioned in lowered voices, the way they mentioned a bad harvest or a house with a leaking foundation. Gretchen was not beautiful in the way that men in Oakhaven seemed to want beautiful. She was fuller-figured, soft, where the other girls were angular, broad through the shoulder and wide at the hip, and her dresses had been let out twice at the waist and once at the hem as she moved through her 20s. She walked with a slight catch in her left step from the fever she'd had at 7 that no one had treated properly, and her hands were a working woman's hands, red-knuckled and rough. She had stopped expecting to be wanted for herself some years back. What she had not stopped expecting was to be treated as a person rather than a line item in someone's accounting. Amos Briggs is not a kind man, she said. Kind don't fill a woodshed, Clem said. He stood and the chair scraped back. We're going to the store at 9. Wear your good dress. She did not answer. He went out, and the door closed, and she stood alone in the kitchen, with the 11 jars of plum jam cooling on the windowsill, and the fire ticking in the stove. The smell of sugar and fruit hung in the air, warm and sweet, and outside the window the sky had gone the pale gold of early morning, the kind of sky that on any other day she would have considered beautiful. She pressed the back of her wrist to her eye once quickly, and then she turned and began to sweep the flour from the floor. She wore the brown dress, not because it was her good dress, because it was not, but because it was the only one that still fit without strain at the buttons, the blue calico having gotten too tight across the back in the past year. The brown dress had been her mother's taken in and let out so many times that the fabric at the seams was thin as paper. She had sewn a fresh collar on it in the fall white cotton that she had washed, until it was bright, and with the collar and her hair pinned up and her apron left at home, she looked, she thought, as respectable as she was likely to manage. Clem walked fast the way he always did, as though he was already late for something. Gretchen kept pace on her left side, the catch in her step more pronounced in the cold, and she watched the ground and let her hands hang at her sides. The main street of Oakhaven was not much to watch in January. The storefronts were gray, the mud of the road was frozen in ridges and ruts, and the few people out this early moved quickly with their chins down in the wind. Nobody looked at her. Nobody ever did. She almost missed it. She would have missed it but for the sound of something small and hurt near the base of the rail platform. She stopped. A bird. A common sparrow, one wing held at the wrong angle, crouching in the frozen mud between 2 iron spikes of the rail line. Someone had spilled grain nearby, maybe from a feed bag loaded onto a boxcar, and the small pile of wheat was scattered across the ground, just out of reach of the bird's good side. Clem did not stop. He was already 10 paces ahead. Gretchen knelt. The cold came through the thin fabric of her dress, at once soaking into her knees, and she did not let herself think about that. She reached into her coat pocket where she had put a handful of dried cornmeal that morning, out of habit, the way she always put something in her pocket when she left the house, because there were always animals that needed something. She gathered up the scattered wheat grain by grain from the frozen ground and added it to the cornmeal and held her cupped hands out low near the bird. It took a long time. The sparrow watched her with one bright black eye, suspicious, the way hurt things are always suspicious. She waited. The wind cut across her face and her knees went numb, and she waited. Gretchen. Clem's voice from up the street, sharp. She set the grain down in a small pile right at the bird's feet, close enough that it didn't need to move far. The sparrow dipped its head and began to eat. She stood her left knee protesting and brushed the dirt from her dress and walked toward the store. She did not know that she had been watched. She did not look up as she walked, so she did not see the man standing in the shadow of the feed store's overhang, big and still as a fence post in the wind. Saistis. His hat low and his eyes tracking her with an expression she would not have known how to read, even if she had seen it. She pushed open the door of Pettifer's general store and stepped into the warmth and the smell of tobacco and wood smoke wrapped around her, and there was Amos Briggs already at the counter, already smiling the smile of a man who has already decided. The contract was on the counter. She had not known there would be a contract. Amos looked at her the way he looked at livestock, thorough and without apology, and he said, "There she is." And her uncle took her by the elbow, and she let herself be led forward, because she did not know what else to do. And the morning she had started alone in a warm kitchen with 11 jars of plum jam lined up like a small and honest hope had become something else entirely. Amos put his fingers around her arm and squeezed and said she was stout-built, and that was what he needed, and someone near the door laughed, and Gretchen looked at the middle distance past his shoulder and kept her hands still and breathed. She felt rather than saw the man in the far corner, the one who had not laughed. Clem reached for the pen. Outside, the sky had gone the color of iron, and the first clouds of what would become a hard storm were piling up against the northern ridge, though no one in Pettifer's general store was looking at the sky just then. Clem signed his name. Then he straightened, tucked the deed to 40 acres of bottomland along Kettle Creek into his coat pocket, and walked out of the store without looking back at her. The door swung shut behind him. The bell above it gave one thin ring. And Gretchen Mueller stood in the middle of Pettifer's general store with Amos Briggs's hand on her arm and the smell of his tobacco in her nose and the deed of her life changing hands in a coat pocket, walking down the street. And she thought with a clarity that surprised her, "I have not agreed to this." She had not agreed to it. But she did not know yet what that meant, or what she could possibly do with a thought like that when the pen was already dry and the paper was already signed. From the corner near the dry goods, the fourth man had still not moved. His hat was still low, his hands were still at his sides, but something had changed in the set of his shoulders, and if Gretchen had looked, which she did not, she might have noticed that his right hand had closed slowly around the brim of the hat he was holding, and that the knuckles of that hand had gone white. Silas Vance had come to Oakhaven for nails. Specifically, he needed 3 pounds of 8-penny nails, and a length of flat iron strap for the hinge on his barn door, which had been pulling loose from the frame since October, and which he had been meaning to fix since October, and which he had put off because putting things off was easier in the fall when the days were still bearable, and the silence of his place on the ridge felt like privacy rather than punishment. By January, the silence had changed its character, as it always did, and he had run out of reasons to stay put. So he had saddled Buck and come down the mountain and tied up at the rail outside Pettifer's and gone in to get his nails. He had not expected to stay long. He did not like towns. He had not liked them since coming back from the war, which was going on 4 years ago now. Though there were mornings when it felt like 4 weeks and evenings when it felt like 40 years. Towns had too many sounds happening at once, voices and wagon wheels and the random bang of a door or a shutter in the wind. And any one of those sounds could, without warning, become something else in his head, something he was not able to explain to anyone who had not been there. So he had stopped trying to explain it and had instead stopped going to towns more than he had to. He had what he needed picked out in under 10 minutes. He set the nails on the counter and waited for Ed Pettifer to come from the back. And while he waited, he stood in the corner with his back to the shelves and his eyes on the door, the way he always stood when he was indoors, with a clear line to the exit and no one behind him. That was when the door opened and the woman came in. He had already seen her, actually, He had seen her on the way in when he was tying Buck to the rail. She had been out on the street with a thin-faced man who walked too fast, and she had stopped at the rail platform, and he had watched, without meaning to watch, while she knelt in the frozen mud in her good dress and held out cupped hands to a bird that was too hurt to fly. He had seen plenty of things in his 35 years. He had seen courage in forms that would strip the paint off a wall. He had seen men do extraordinary things for reasons that held up in daylight and reasons that did not. But he stood on the board sidewalk with his hand on Buck's bridle and watched a woman in a thin coat hold out a handful of grain to a broken sparrow in January cold, and something in his chest did a thing he did not have a word for and did not try to find one. Then her uncle had called her name sharp and impatient, and she had stood and dusted her dress and walked toward the store without once looking up to see if anyone had noticed, as though the whole of what she had just done was a private thing not worth mentioning. He had gone in after her. Now he stood in his corner and watched Amos Briggs put his hand on her arm, and the nails on the counter in front of him had ceased to matter. He knew Amos Briggs the way you know a man without knowing him personally, by reputation, and by the quality of silence that settled over a room when he walked in. Briggs had come up from Texas 15 years back with money that nobody asked too hard about, and had bought land along Kettle Creek piece by piece, until he had the best bottomland in the valley. He was not a man who took no for an answer, because he had arranged his life so that no was never an option anyone around him felt they could afford. Silas had heard about his first wife. He had heard about the woman before her, too. He watched Briggs squeeze the woman's arm like he was checking the firmness of a fence post, and he heard what Briggs said about her being stout-built, and he heard the laughter from the men near the door, and he watched the woman's chin drop and her hands disappear into her apron, and he recognized with a precision that was almost physical exactly what he was looking at. He was looking at someone who had learned that the safest place to be was invisible. He knew that place. He had been living in it for 4 years. Ed Pettifer came out from the back and began counting the nails into a paper sack, and Silas paid without speaking and tucked the sack under his arm and picked up the length of iron strap and did not leave. He told himself he was waiting to see how it played out. He told himself it was not his business. He was good at telling himself things that were technically true and practically useless. The thin-faced uncle signed the paper and pocketed whatever he had been given, and walked out, and the bell above the door rang, and the woman stood in the middle of the store floor with Briggs's hand still on her arm, and the look on her face of someone calculating how much of this they could survive. Silas set the iron strap back on the counter. He crossed the floor. He did not do it loudly. He did not do it in a way that announced itself. He simply moved from the corner to the center of the room, and the men near the door stepped back without quite knowing why, the way men step back from a fence when they become aware that what is on the other side is larger than they had accounted for. "Briggs," he said. Amos turned. He was a big man, Briggs broad through the middle and used to being the largest presence in a room. He looked at Silas with the look of a man deciding whether he needs to be concerned, and Silas watched him decide that no, probably not. This was just some rough-looking cowhand with a paper sack of nails. "Vance," Briggs said. His voice stayed easy. "Didn't know you came down off that mountain of yours. Now and then?" Silas looked at the hand on the woman's arm. He did not say anything about it directly. He just looked at it, and then he looked at Briggs, and something in the quality of that look made Briggs's fingers loosen by a degree. The woman had not moved. She was standing very still, her chin down, her hands in her apron, and she was watching the floor with the focused attention of someone who has learned to make themselves small in the hope that small things don't get noticed. "This is a private business arrangement," Briggs said, "between me and Clem Mueller." "I reckon it is," Silas said. "I'm just picking up my goods." He went back to the counter. He picked up the iron strap. He did not leave. Briggs watched him for a moment and then turned back to the business of pulling on his coat and saying something to the woman about getting her things together that they would leave before the weather came in. The woman said nothing. She just stood where she had been put and waited. Silas looked at the window. The sky outside had gone the color of a dirty fleece, low and close, and the light had the flat, muffled quality that came before hard snow. He had seen that sky enough times to know what it meant. The storm he had watched building on the northern ridge for 2 days was coming in faster than he had expected. Briggs got his coat on and took the woman by the arm again, less gently this time, and steered her toward the door. She went her left foot, catching just slightly on the uneven board floor, and she did not look up, and the men near the door parted for Briggs the way they always did, and the bell rang and they were outside. Silas was out the door 12 seconds after them. The wind hit him first, a hard gust off the ridge that carried ice crystals in it, sharp against the face. Briggs was at his wagon, and he had been drinking. Silas could tell from 20 feet away by the way he moved too deliberate, in the way that men get deliberate when they are working to compensate for something unreliable in their legs. The woman was standing beside the wagon wheel, her arms around herself, waiting to be told what to do. Briggs put his boot on the wheel, spoke to climb up, and the spoke was icy, and his boot slipped. He went down on one knee in the frozen mud and came up furious, the way drunk men come up from embarrassment, swearing at the wagon and the weather and the woman in a voice that carried down the empty street. He grabbed the reins, and the horse startled, and he jerked the reins hard and swore again. And then he was up on the bench, and he looked down at the woman and said something. Silas did not catch over the wind, and then he slapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward, without the woman in it. She stumbled back when the wagon moved, catching herself on the wheel rut, and then the wagon was past her and Briggs was gone, around the corner, toward the creek road, and the woman was standing alone in the middle of the street with the first real snow of the season beginning to fall. She stood there for a moment, just stood there, in the way of someone who has been in motion so long that stopping feels like a new language they have to translate. Then her knees went. Silas was already moving. He covered the distance in a few long strides and reached her before she went down completely, and he did not grab her the way Briggs had grabbed her, did not take her by the arm. He put himself between her and the wind, and he held out his hand, palm up open, and waited. She looked at his hand, then up at his face, briefly, quickly, the way a person looks at a bright light. Her eyes were gray, he registered, gray and red-rimmed and careful. She took his hand. He got her upright and kept hold of her hand only long enough to be sure she was steady, and then he let go. The snow was coming in earnest now, not gentle sideways and mean, and the temperature was dropping by the minute. He looked up the street, which was empty, and at the stores, which were closing their shutters, and at the sky, which had made its intentions perfectly clear. "You got somewhere to go?" he asked. She looked down the road where Briggs's wagon had gone. Then she looked at the store behind them, where Ed Pettifer was pulling his door shut. Then she looked at her own hands. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet and even, not the voice of someone asking for help, just an honest answer to an honest question. The wind gusted and she swayed with it, and he made a decision of the kind he had made many times, the kind that presents itself not as a choice, but as a simple fact of what needs doing. "My place is up on the ridge," he said. 20 minutes on horseback. You'll freeze out here." She looked at him. She was doing that thing again, calculating, measuring the known danger of the cold against the unknown quality of this man. He understood it. He did not rush it. "I ain't Briggs," he said. It was the most he could offer, and they both knew it. Something in her face shifted, not dramatically, not in a way you could point to, but the calculation resolved itself. She gave one small nod. He brought Buck around, and he helped her up, taking her elbow only when she needed the steadying. And he swung up behind her and turned the horse toward the ridge road. The snow closed in around them almost at once, thick and fast, muffling the sounds of the town. And within a minute, Oakhaven had disappeared behind the white curtain, and there was only the wind and the horse's breath and the ridge rising ahead of them. She sat straight in front of him, not leaning back, keeping herself contained in the careful way of a person who does not want to take up more space than they have been given. He did not comment on this. He kept his arms out to either side of her, holding the reins, and the warmth of the horse moved up through both of them, and the cold pressed in from every other direction. After a while she began to shiver. Not the small shiver of discomfort, but the deeper shake of a body that is working hard to stay warm, and starting to lose the argument. Without making a thing of it, he reached with one hand and unclasped the front of his heavy coat and drew it open and settled it around her like a wing. And she went rigid for a moment at the closeness. And then the warmth got through and the rigidity eased, and she held very still inside the shelter of it. The smell of pine and wood smoke and cold leather came off the coat, and she breathed it in without meaning to. The cabin came into view through the trees when they were almost on top of it, dark log walls and a snow-covered roof, and one window with the faint orange suggestion of coals still going in the stove inside. He had banked the fire before he left. He always banked the fire because coming back to a cold cabin had become, in the years since the war, something he could not bring himself to do. He got down and helped her down, and got Buck into the small barn and forked hay, and came back to the cabin. She was waiting on the porch, not at the door asking to be let in. On the porch in the snow, waiting for permission. He opened the door and held it, and she went in. The cabin was one room clean, in the sparse way of a man who has not had enough things to make a mess with. A cook stove, a table with one chair, a bed in the far corner, heavy blankets folded military neat at the foot, a row of pegs for coats by the door, a stack of wood that would last the week. She stood in the middle of the room with snow melting in her hair and looked at the space with the expression of someone inventorying their situation. He put a log on the stove and opened the damper, and the fire caught. The light in the room changed, going from gray to orange, and the cold began to pull back from the walls. "You can have the bed," he said. "I'll sleep on the floor." She turned and looked at him, and he could see her trying to work out what that cost, what it meant, what would be asked in return. He had seen that calculation before on other faces. It was not pleasant to see. "I don't want anything from you," he said. "I mean to say I ain't going to ask you for anything. You need a place out of the cold. That's all this is." A long moment. The fire popped inside the stove. "Much obliged," she said finally. Her voice was still quiet, still even, still in the register of a woman who has learned to take up as little space as possible. He nodded and went to the floor and sat with his back against the wall, and his knees up, and pulled his coat over his shoulders, and she went to the far side of the room and sat on the edge of the bed, straight-backed, hands in her lap. Outside, the wind hit the cabin hard enough to shutter the walls, and the snow drove against the single window in long white streaks, and it became clear, in the way that a January blizzard makes things clear, that neither of them was going anywhere for some time. The fire settled into a steady burn. She looked at the cook stove with an expression he could not read. And then she looked at her own hands, and then she said, not quite to him, not quite to herself, There's no flour, I reckon. He glanced at the shelf above the stove. Half a sack, he said, and some dried apples. I don't cook much. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I do. He did not answer right away. He looked at the shelf and then at her, and something about the steadiness of the way she said it, not asking, not performing, just stating a plain fact about herself, made him feel obscurely that he had been handed something he did not know what to do with. All right, he said. She nodded once. Then she folded her hands in her lap and looked at the fire and said nothing more, and he said nothing more, and the storm wrapped the cabin in white, and the coals ticked in the stove, and the night came down fast and early, the way it does in January at altitude. He was still awake. An hour later, when her breathing evened out, and she finally carefully lay down on top of the blankets, without getting under them, as though she had not yet decided if she had earned that much. He pulled the extra blanket from the hook by the door and crossed the room and set it over her quietly, without touching her, and went back to his place on the floor. He lay in the dark and listened to the storm, and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill he had worked hard to develop, and outside the wind found a gap somewhere in the chinking of the north wall, and made a sound that was almost but not quite a voice, and his hands went flat against the floor. And he breathed through it and waited for it to change. And after a while it did. He did not sleep until nearly morning. He rarely did. But when he finally went under the dream that usually came, the one with the noise and the smoke and the particular quality of light in a Virginia field in summer, did not come. Whether that meant something or nothing, he could not have said. He was not a man who put much stock in what dreams meant. He was a man who put stock in what he could see and touch and repair with his own hands. The rest he left alone. Across the room in the firelight, Gretchen Muller slept without moving her hands, for once open and empty on top of the blanket, and the cabin held them both in its walls, of pine log and chinking and old, honest wood. And the storm outside pressed down on everything and made the world very small and very quiet, and morning was still a long way off. She woke before him. That was habit, the same habit that had gotten her out of bed at 4 a.m. every day of her adult life, the internal clock of a person who has learned that the hours before anyone else is awake are the safest hours, the hours that belong to no one, and therefore briefly to her. She lay still for a moment in the gray pre-dawn and looked at the ceiling of the cabin, at the dark pine boards and the single iron hook screwed into the beam above the bed, and she listened to the storm. It was still going. She could hear it in the way the walls breathed a slow rhythmic pressure and release, and in the sound at the window, which had changed overnight from the hard slap of driving snow to a lower, steadier moan that meant the wind had settled in for the long work. She had lived in Kansas long enough to know that sound. It meant days, not hours. She turned her head carefully and looked across the room. He was asleep on the floor with his back against the wall, his long legs stretched out and crossed at the ankle, his coat pulled up to his chin. His hat was over his face. In sleep he looked younger than 35, or maybe just less armored, the hard set of his jaw gone loose, the lines between his brows smoothed out. The scar along his left jaw caught the faint light from the stove's air vent, a pale seam against the darker skin, and she looked at it briefly and then looked away, because it felt like looking at something private. She got up without making noise. She was good at that. The floor was cold through her stockings, and she moved to the stove and fed it 2 logs from the stack, and opened the damper a quarter turn, and listened to the fire find itself again. Then she went to the shelf above the stove and took stock of what was there. Half a sack of flour, as he had said, a tin of baking powder nearly full, salt in a crock, the dried apples a good double handful, a small jar of bacon grease, 2 eggs in a tin cup, which surprised her because she had not known there were chickens, and she looked out the frost-rimed window toward the barn, and could just make out in the gray light a small coop attached to the near side, and revised her understanding of what this place contained. She worked quietly. She did not have a recipe for what she was making because she had never needed one. The proportions living in her hands the way certain knowledge lives in the body, and not in the head. She mixed the flour and baking powder and salt and cut in the bacon grease with the edge of a spoon, and added water from the bucket by the door, cold enough to make her knuckles ache, and worked the dough until it was right. She sliced the dried apples thin and tossed them with the last 1/4 inch of sugar she found in a paper twist at the back of the shelf, and a scrape of cinnamon from a small tin that was nearly empty. She did not have a pie pan. She used the cast iron skillet, pressing the dough up the sides the way her mother had taught her in a kitchen that no longer existed, and she laid the apples in and folded the dough over the top and set it on the stove's top plate over the lowest heat she could manage. The smell that came off it slowly as the fat in the dough began to heat and the apples began to soften in their sugar and spice was the smell of a kitchen that was being used by someone who knew what they were doing. It was a specific smell different from the smell of food as fuel, which was what the cabin had always contained. It was the smell of intention, of care taken. "That's not nothing," said a voice from across the room. She startled. She had thought he was still asleep. She turned and he was sitting up against the wall with his hat in his lap, watching her. His eyes in the low morning light were a dark grayish-brown, the color of creek water in shade, and they were more awake than she would have expected. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "I used the last of your sugar." "I don't cook," he said, "so I don't mind what gets used." She turned back to the stove and checked the heat. "There's enough flour for bread today, and biscuits tomorrow. After that we'll need to think about rationing. Storm'll break in 3 days," he said. She did not point out that she had no way of knowing that, and neither did he, strictly speaking. "All right," she said. He got up from the floor in the way of a man who has slept in worse places than floors, and does not consider it worth remarking on, and he pulled on his boots and his coat, and took the bucket and went out into the storm to check on the horse and the chickens. She heard the barn door, and then nothing but the wind, and she was alone in the cabin with the smell of apple and cinnamon and the fire ticking and the snow making its long sounds against the walls. She found herself thinking against her better judgment that this was not the worst morning she had ever had. He came back with 2 more eggs and a look on his face that said the chickens were displeased about the weather, but otherwise intact. He set the eggs on the shelf and poured water into the tin cup for coffee, and she had already found the coffee tin and had it going. And he stopped and looked at the cup in his hand, and then at the pot on the stove, and then at her. "Much obliged," he said. "It's your coffee," she said. He sat down at the table, which had 1 chair and no second chair, and she remained standing at the stove, which was how she always ate when there was not enough seating, which had been most of her life. He looked at the table and then at her, and then he got up and went to the corner near the barn wall and dragged out a wooden crate that had been used for storage, and he turned it on its end and set it across the table from his chair and looked at it and then at her. "It ain't comfortable," he said. She sat on the crate. It was not comfortable. It was perfectly fine. They ate the apple, skillet bread, without speaking. And it was good, genuinely good, and she knew it was good because she had made it, and she knew the difference, and she watched him eat it with the focused attention of a man who has been eating without tasting for some time, and has suddenly been reminded that tasting is possible. He did not compliment it in words. He had a second portion, which was the same thing. That was the first day. The second day the storm did not let up, and she made bread from the flour, and they ate it with the bacon grease and the last of a smoked sausage she found hanging from a hook in the lean-to outside the back wall, and they talked a little practical things, how much wood was left and where the creek was relative to the cabin, in case the snow got deep enough to need water. And she learned that he had come to this place 3 years ago, after, as he said it, after the war, and that the land was his outright 160 acres of ridge and timber that he had filed on under the Homestead Act, and that he had not had a neighbor closer than 4 miles since he arrived, and that he had arranged it that way deliberately. She did not ask him about the war. Some doors you don't knock on when they're closed. The second night she slept better. She did not know why, except that the cabin had begun to feel less like a trap and more like a place, and the difference between those two things was significant. On the third night the wind found the gap in the north wall chinking in earnest. She was already awake, sitting by the stove with her knees up and her arms around them, unable to sleep for reasons she could not name when the sound started. Not a loud sound, not the bang of a shutter or the crack of a branch, just the wind finding a small hole and pushing through it in a way that was almost a note, almost a voice, sustained and wavering. She heard him before she saw him move, a sharp intake of breath, and then a sound that was not a word. And then she looked across the room, and he was on his feet, with his back against the wall and his hands out, and his eyes open, but not seeing the cabin, seeing something else, somewhere else. She had not known about the war and what it had done to him, not in any specific way, but she was not ignorant of what war did to men. She had seen it in Oak Haven, in the way certain men sat with their backs to walls in the saloon, and did not like crowds, and went quiet around sudden noise. She had seen it in the preacher's oldest son, who had come back from the fighting, and never quite come all the way back. She recognized what she was looking at. She did not go to him. She understood by some instinct she could not have articulated that going to him would be wrong, that he needed space, not presence, that a body moving toward him in the dark would make things worse. She stayed where she was, by the stove, and she thought for a moment, and then she began to sing, not loudly, not as a performance. She began the way you begin a thing when you are alone and the night is long, almost under her breath, the first hymn that came to her hands, the way the bread dough came to her hands, from somewhere below conscious thought. It was an old German hymn her mother had sung, but she sang it in English because her English was better than her German now. And it was slow and low, and in a range that sat in the room without demanding anything. Praise to the Lord, the Almighty, the King of creation. She sang it through once quietly, looking at the stove. Then she began again. The sound of his breathing changed, not immediately, gradually. The way a fever breaks, not in one dramatic moment, but by degrees, the temperature dropping fraction by fraction, until the body remembers that cool is its natural state. She sang it through 3 times. By the 3rd time, his back had come away from the wall. By the end of it, he was sitting on the floor with his knees up and his hands between his knees and his head down, breathing. She let the song end and did not start another one. The silence that came after was a different kind of silence than the one before, softer at the edges. After a while, he said, without looking up, "How'd you know to do that?" It was not quite a question. "I didn't," she said. "I just didn't want to make it worse." He was quiet for a long time. The fire ticked. The wind had found a different register outside, lower, less like a voice. "It's been 4 years," he said finally. "You'd think." "I reckon some things don't care how many years it's been," she said. He looked up then. He looked at her across the room in the firelight, and she did not drop her eyes the way she usually did. She held the look for a moment, just a moment, and then she looked back at the stove, because it seemed like the right amount. "That's true," he said. "That's exactly right." She did not answer. She pulled her knees a little closer and watched the glow from the stove's vent, and listened to the storm settling into its lower tone, and after a while, she heard him move back to his place against the wall, and after a while longer, his breathing slowed to the rhythm of sleep, and she sat alone by the fire, and thought about what it meant to be exactly right to someone, and how long it had been since she had been that to anyone at all. She was still thinking about it when she fell asleep sitting up, her head tilted against the warm iron side of the stove. She woke with a crick in her neck and the smell of coffee already going, and he was crouched by the stove, seeing to the fire with his back to her, and on the floor beside her someone had set her coat folded as a cushion. She had not had the night before. She looked at the folded coat for a long moment, then she got up and started on the biscuits. The fourth day, the storm was quieter, still present, but tired the way storms get when they have done most of what they came to do. The snow had drifted against the north wall, up to the window, and the world outside was white and still and very bright when the clouds thinned. She stood at the window with her coffee and looked out at it, at the pine trees with their heavy white sleeves and the ridge above them cutting a clean dark line against the pale sky, and she thought it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in some years. She did not say this out loud, because it seemed like a foolish thing to say when you were stranded in a stranger's cabin with no clear idea of what was going to happen next. He came in from the barn with a look on his face she had come to recognize as his version of good news, which was not a smile exactly, but a slight loosening around the eyes. "Chickens laid 3 this morning," he said. "Storm always does that, confuses them. We could have eggs for supper," she said. "Reckon so, sestete." He sat at the table and took out the small knife he carried and a piece of pine from the woodpile, a soft, straight-grained piece, and he began to work it with the knife in the slow, deliberate way of a man who needs something for his hands to do. She watched from the corner of her eye as she worked at the table beside him, rolling out the biscuit dough. The shavings came off the pine in thin, pale curls and piled up between them on the table, and the smell of fresh-cut pine joined the smell of the biscuits beginning to heat. And the combination was something she did not have a word for, but that settled somewhere in her chest like a warm hand laid flat. After a while she noticed he had stopped shaping the wood in an aimless direction and had begun on something specific, a deliberate narrowing and rounding that had a purpose she could not yet make out. She did not ask. She worked her dough. By the time the biscuits came off the stove, he had set down the carving, brushed the shavings into the fire, and gone to the corner, where her coat and her things were hung. She saw him pick up her left shoe, the one she had taken off the night before, because the stitching at the heel was pulling and it had been rubbing a blister. He turned it over in his hands, examining it the way he had examined the barn hinge as a problem with a solution. Then he fitted the piece of carved pine he had been working, smoothed now, and shaped precisely into the inside of the heel, wedging it gently into the worn-out space where the original support had long since collapsed. He did not say anything about it. He set the shoe back where he had found it and went and washed his hands in the bucket, and came back to the table and ate his biscuits. She stood very still for a moment at the stove. She had walked with that catch in her left step for 19 years. 19 years of people stepping over her on the sidewalk of uneven ground, catching her off guard, of the small daily reminder that something in her had not been repaired when it should have been. Not one person in 19 years had looked at her shoe and thought, "This is a problem I can fix." She put her shoe on. She walked from the stove to the window and back. The difference was not enormous and was enormous. She did not thank him directly. She could tell by the way he was attending to his biscuit that he did not want to be thanked directly. She refilled his coffee cup without being asked, and he said, "Much obliged." And she said, "It's your coffee," which was what she always said, and that was the whole of it, and it was sufficient. That evening they sat by the stove, with the last of the daylight coming gray through the window, and she told him without planning to tell him about her parents. Not the whole of it, the shape of it, the fever year, the 2 deaths, the uncle with his thin face, and his accounting of what she cost versus what she was worth. She told it the way she told most things, plainly and without decoration, looking at her hands. He listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been in her experience. When she was done, he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "My father was like that, a man who kept accounts." She waited. "Everything you did went in one column or the other," he said, "asset or liability. I was a liability most of my boyhood." He paused. "Then I was big enough to be useful, so I became an asset. That's a bad thing to learn about yourself at 12 years old. That your value is what you can carry." She looked at him. He was looking at the stove. "Then the war," she said quietly, not a question. "Then the war," he said. He did not say more than that, and she did not ask for more than that. She looked back at her own hands, which were resting in her lap, open, not hidden under anything. On the 5th day, the storm blew itself out by mid-morning, and left a silence behind it that was enormous and clean and white in every direction. They stood on the porch and looked at it, the 2 of them, and the air was so cold and so clear that breathing it felt like drinking from a spring. She looked at her hands on the porch railing, red-knuckled, work-scarred, and she noticed that she was not hiding them. She was just looking at them in the winter light, the way you look at something that belongs to you. She did not remark on this either, but she noticed it. That evening, the last night of the storm's aftermath, the wind entirely gone, and the cold settled in dry and absolute. He spread the heavy wool blanket on the floor in front of the stove, and they sat on it side by side, not close enough to touch, with their backs against the front of the stove casing. And the firelight coming through the vent in shifting orange patterns on the wall across from them. His shoulder was perhaps 4 inches from hers, maybe 3. She was not afraid of those 4 inches. She noticed that she was not afraid, and she noticed that noticing it did not make her afraid either. And she sat with that quiet fact for a while, and let the fire warm the back of her neck. He was whittling again, something very small this time, and the sound of the knife on the wood was soft and regular and comfortable, the sound of a man who is. For this moment, nowhere else but here. Outside, somewhere in the dark trees on the ridge, an owl asked its one repeated question, and the stars above the snow were the hard, bright stars of deep winter, indifferent and beautiful. And the cabin held its warmth against the cold, with the particular stubbornness of a thing built to last. And the 2 people inside it sat in a silence that was not empty, and let the evening pass without rushing it toward anything. She did not look at him. He did not look at her. They sat with the 3 or 4 inches of air between them, and that air was warm, warmer than the rest of the room. Or maybe she only thought it was, and she breathed it in, and looked at the fire patterns on the wall, and thought of nothing at all, and was for the first time in a long time, simply present in a place, and not waiting to be sent away from it. The fire settled. The owl went quiet. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. She had learned early not to trust tomorrow with too much. But this evening, this specific evening, with its wood smoke and its wool blanket and its 4 inches of warm air, was hers, and she kept it carefully, the way she had kept the sparrow's grain cupped in both hands, not squeezing. Then from far down the valley road, carried thin and clear on the cold night air, came the sound of horses. More than one, all moving at a pace that had purpose in it. She felt him go still beside her. He heard it before she fully registered what it was. She felt the change in him first, the way the air around a person changes when they go from at rest to alert, a subtle drawing and a gathering of attention that had nothing to do with movement and everything to do with readiness. He set down the whittling knife. He did not stand up yet. He listened. The horses were still far down the valley road, but coming on steadily, the sound of them clear and deliberate in the frozen air. Not one horse, not two, 3, maybe 4. The particular rhythm of animals being pushed at a working pace, rather than a traveling one. "You recognize that road?" she asked. Her voice was quiet. "It comes up from Oakhaven," he said. "Only road that does." She set her hands flat on her knees. The warmth of the evening, the wool blanket and the firelight and the 4 inches of air that had felt like something worth keeping was still physically present, but had become something she was observing from a slight distance, the way you observe a thing you know you are about to lose. He stood up. He went to the window and looked out at the dark and whatever he could see or not see in the moonlight on the snow. He stood there for a full minute without speaking. "Get your coat," he said. "Silas." She said his name for the first time, and the sound of it surprised her, how naturally it came, how much she had apparently been thinking it without saying it. "You don't have to do anything on my account." Eh? He turned from the window and looked at her, and his face in the firelight was the face she had come to know over 5 days, not warm in any soft or easy way, but steady, the face of a man who has made a decision and is not going to be talked out of it by any argument, including a reasonable one. "Get your coat," he said again. She got her coat. She put on her shoes. Both of them, the left one with the carved pine support he had fitted without comment, and she laced them, and stood up, and pulled her coat around her, and waited by the stove with her hands in her pockets. The horses were louder now. Close enough to hear the individual footfalls separating themselves from the general sound, the creak of tack. A man's voice saying something brief and directing. He banked the stove. He did it with the methodical, unhurried efficiency of a man who has learned not to waste motion, and she watched him and thought that this was what competence looked like when it had no need to perform itself. Then he took his coat from the peg and his hat, and he went to stand by the door. The horses came into the yard. She heard them stop. She heard the creak of someone dismounting, the sound of boots in packed snow. And then the particular sound of a man who is accustomed to his own authority, climbing the 2 steps to a porch. 3 hard knocks on the door. He opened it. The cold came in first, a breath of it sharp and immediate. Then the figures against the white of the snow and the moonlight, and she saw them from where she stood. Amos Briggs in front, with his hat straight, and his face the color of a man who has been nursing a grievance for 5 days, and has now arrived at the place where he intends to settle it. Beside him Clem, her uncle, thinner looking than she remembered, which was not possible in 5 days, but was how he looked. Diminished somehow a man who had spent the last 5 days trying to convince himself he had done a reasonable thing, and, behind them both, Sheriff Carl Hodge, his star catching the moonlight, his face arranged in the expression of a man who is here officially and would prefer to be elsewhere. There were 2 other men further back, hands in coats, staying with the horses. She did not know them. Amos looked past Silas and found her immediately, the way a man looks when he has already decided where the thing he wants is going to be. "There she is," he said. It was the same thing he had said in the store, the same voice. She wondered if he had any other opening. Silas said nothing. He filled the doorway in a way that was not aggressive and not yielding, simply present the way a wall is present. "Stand aside, Vance," Amos said. "I got business here and the law with me to see it done proper." "Good evening, Carl," Silas said, speaking past Amos to the sheriff. Hodge pulled at the collar of his coat. "Silas," he said, "there's been a complaint filed concerning the woman." "What kind of complaint?" "Amos says she was removed from his custody without consent. Says you took her off in the storm." "Storm took her off," Silas said. "I got her out of the cold, which is what anyone with a shred of decency would have done after she was put out of a wagon in a blizzard." Amos's color deepened. She was not put out. She failed to board in time. "She was standing in the middle of the street in 6 inches of new snow," Silas said. "I was there." "I don't care where you were." Amos stepped forward, and from inside his coat, he produced the contract, or what she assumed was a copy of it, folded and creased from being handled many times in 5 days. He held it up. The paper caught the moonlight. 400 acres of prime bottomland. Signed and witnessed. "That woman is spoken for, under a legal instrument, and I am here to collect what I paid for." Behind Silas, Gretchen felt the words land in her body, the way cold lands when you step outside, without a coat, sudden and total. She had known this was coming. She had known it in the back of every warm moment of the past 5 days, known it the way you know a debt is still there, even when you are not thinking about it. But knowing a thing and feeling it arrive were different operations entirely. And she stood with her hands in her pockets and her left foot solid on the floor, and she made herself breathe. She would not cry in front of Amos Briggs. She had decided that some years ago about a different man, and the decision held. Clem had not looked at her since the door opened. He was studying the middle boards of the porch with great attention. Silas had not moved. He looked at the contract in Amos's hand, and then at Amos, and then briefly at Hodge, and whatever passed through his mind in that moment did not show on his face. "Let me see it," he said. Amos pulled it back. "It ain't for your inspection. It's for your compliance. If you want me to stand aside based on a legal instrument," Silas said, "I reckon I got a right to read the instrument." A pause. Hodge made a small sound that might have been agreement. Amos, after a moment of visible irritation, held the contract out. Silas took it. He read it. She could not see his face from where she stood, but she saw the set of his shoulders, and the way he held the paper, and the stillness of him while he read. And then she saw his right hand move to his coat pocket. He took out a match. Just one from the small tin he kept in his breast pocket. She stopped breathing. Amos saw it too. "Don't you dare," he said, and his voice had gone from authority to warning, a different register entirely. "That is a legal document filed with the county clerk. You destroy that, and I will have you in front of a judge before the snow melts." Silas looked at him. The match was between 2 fingers unlit. "Carl," Silas said, not looking away from Amos, "is this woman here of her own will or against it?" Hodge cleared his throat. "That ain't exactly the relevant question under the terms of the contract. It's the only question that matters to me," Silas said. "So I'm asking it. Gretchen, you want to go with this man?" She heard her name. She heard it the way she had heard it from him all week, without contempt or impatience, without the weight of obligation in it. Just her name, plainly said, as though she were a person whose answer was going to be taken seriously. She looked at Amos, at his red face, and his held contract, and his absolute certainty, that he was owed. She looked at Clem, who was still studying the porch boards. She looked at Hodge, who was looking at his own boots. "No," she said, clear and even, the same voice she used for every true thing. Silas struck the match against the sole of his boot. The flame came up small and orange in the dark, and he held it to the corner of the contract. And the paper caught at once, the dry old parchment going fast at the edges, and then spreading toward the center. He held it until the flame reached his fingers, and then he turned his hand and let the burning remnant fall into the snow at the base of the porch steps, where it finished itself in a small bright flare and went dark. The ash lay on the snow, black against white, weightless. Amos made a sound that started as words and became something without words. He took one step forward onto the porch, and his hand went to the side of his coat, not to the holster yet, but near it, and the two men by the horses shifted their weight. Silas turned to face him fully. He was not a man who postured. He did not widen his stance or raise his hands or do any of the things that men do when they are performing a threat. He simply stood in front of the door of his cabin in the January night with the ash of the contract at his feet and looked at Amos Briggs with the level, unhurried attention of a man who has been in worse places than this and made it out and is not frightened of what is in front of him. The voice that came from him was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried in the cold air with the same quality that a bell carries, clear and resonant. And it went past Amos and Clem, and reached Hodge and the men by the horses and the dark tree line and the snow and the whole cold night. No soul of God's making can be traded for 40 acres. She belongs to no one but herself, and from this moment forward, she rides under my protection. AC says it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that forms around a thing that has been said and cannot be unsaid, that has altered the shape of the air it moved through. Amos's hand had stopped moving. His face had gone through several colors and arrived at a deep, suffused red that was partly fury and partly something else, something less comfortable, something adjacent to shame. His jaw worked. "You burned a legal document," he said. His voice had lost its authority. What was left was grievance, raw and small. "That's a crime, Vance." "The document concerned the purchase of a person," Silas said. "I'll take my chances with any court in this territory on that point." Amos looked at Hodge. Hodge was looking at the ash on the snow. He pulled at his coat collar again and pushed his hat up on his forehead and let out a long breath that made a cloud in the cold air. He was a man of approximately 60 who had been sheriff of Oakhaven for 11 years and who had, in those 11 years, developed a strong preference for situations that resolved themselves without requiring him to make decisions he would have to live with afterward. He looked at the ash. He looked at Amos. He looked at Silas. He looked at Gretchen standing in the doorway behind Silas, and for the first time since he had arrived, he met her eyes, and something in his face arranged itself into an expression that was not quite an apology and was as close to one as she supposed he could manage. "The document has been destroyed," Hodge said, in the flat official voice of a man reading from a page that does not exist. "I cannot enforce a contract I cannot produce. I don't see any evidence of a binding legal obligation here." He paused. "Amos, I reckon we ought to head back before the temperature drops further." Amos stared at him. Carl. Amos. A long moment. Amos looked at the ash. He looked at Silas. He looked at Clem, who was still devoted to the study of the porch boards, and who showed no sign of being a resource in this situation. His hand moved away from his coat. "This ain't finished," Amos said. He said it to Silas, and he said it to the night, and he said it to whatever audience he imagined was keeping score. Then he turned and went down the porch steps and back to his horse, and the men by the horses moved to their own animals, and after a moment Clem followed, and he did not look at her as he went, not once. And she watched him mount and turn his horse, and she felt a complicated thing about that, and she let herself feel it without hurrying it toward any particular resolution. Hodge was last. He put his hat back straight on his head, and he looked at Silas and gave a small nod. The nod of one man to another. That means, I reckon you know what you're doing, and I reckon I hope so too. Then he went to his horse and mounted and rode after the others, and the sound of the hooves moved down the valley road and grew smaller and smaller until it was nothing, just the wind in the pines and the cold, and the enormous dark winter sky with its hard stars. Silas stood on the porch until the sound was completely gone. Then he turned and looked at her, and she was still standing in the doorway, with her coat on and her hands at her sides, and she was not crying. She had promised herself she would not cry in front of Amos Briggs, and she had kept that promise. But Amos Briggs was gone now, and Silas Vance was here, and the specific quality of his looking at her steady and direct and asking nothing made the promise harder to keep. She kept it anyway. She breathed through it. "You burned the contract," she said. "I did," he said. "He'll make trouble." "Probably," he said. Men like that generally do. He came back inside, and she stepped back to let him pass, and he went to the stove and added a log and adjusted the damper and did these things with the same deliberate, unhurried attention he brought to every physical task. And she stood in the middle of the room and watched him and tried to locate within herself some map of where she was and where she was going, and could not find one. "Silas," she said. He turned. She opened her mouth and could not immediately find the words for what she meant to say, which was something about what it meant to have someone stand in a doorway on her behalf, something about the specific weight of being spoken for by someone who had chosen to speak for her, rather than being compelled to. Something about the ash on the snow and how she had watched it and felt something in herself go quiet that had been making noise for 26 years. She did not find the words for any of that. "Thank you," she said instead, which was inadequate and true. He looked at her for a moment. In the firelight, the scar along his jaw was a pale line, and his eyes were dark, and the expression on his face was the one she had no name for, the one that was not warmth exactly, but was what warmth came from something older and quieter than warmth. "Gretchen," he said. She waited. He opened his mouth and closed it again, and she watched him locate and then set aside whatever he had been about to say, the way a man sets down a tool he is not ready to use yet. "Get some rest," he said. "Morning'll come early." She nodded. She went to the bed and sat on the edge of it and looked at her hands in her lap, and behind her she heard him settle onto the floor in his place by the wall, and the fire settled into its slow, even breathing. And outside the cold held everything in its grip, and the stars were indifferent and beautiful, and the ash on the snow had already blown away and the wind gone entirely, as though the contract had never been. She lay down. She looked at the ceiling. Far down the valley from the direction of Oak Haven, a single shot rang out in the dark. She sat up. Silas was already at the window. She could see him in profile against the glass still and listening, his right hand flat on the wall beside the frame. The shot had been distant far enough down the valley that the cold air had thinned it to something almost abstract. A punctuation mark on the dark rather than a threat with a location. He stood and listened for a full minute. No second shot. "Hunting," he said, "or a man with bad judgment and whiskey." He paused. Could be Amos running his temper out on a fence post. She let out the breath she had been holding. You don't know that. No, he said, but I know the distance. That was the far side of Kettle Creek, 3 miles at least. Nothing coming up this road tonight. He came back to his place on the floor and sat down and pulled his coat over his shoulders. She lay back down. The ceiling above her was the same dark pine it had always been, and she stared at it and listened to the silence that followed the shot, which was complete and unbroken, and gradually her heart found its normal pace again. She did not sleep for a long time. She did not think he slept, either, though he was still and quiet in his corner. They lay in their separate places in the dark, and listened to the night, and said nothing, and this, too, she understood, was a form of being together, that she had not previously had a name for. Morning came clear and very cold. She woke to the sound of him already outside the chunk of an axe splitting wood. A regular sound, neither hurried nor slow. She built the fire up from the coals and put the coffee on and stood at the window and watched him for a moment before he knew she was watching. He worked with the economy of a man who has done a thing 10,000 times and has made his peace with doing it 10,000 more. The cold had reddened the back of his neck above his collar. His breath came in even clouds. The split wood landed in the pile with a sound like a single, clean note repeated. She turned away from the window and made biscuits. He came in with an armload of wood and stacked it and poured his coffee and sat at the table, and she set the biscuits on the board between them and sat on her crate, and they ate in the easy quiet that had developed between them over 5 days. The quiet of two people who have learned the shape of each other's silence and do not find it threatening. After a while he said, I'll ride into Oakhaven today. Talk to Carl Hodge. Make sure Amos don't try to file anything with the county clerk before I get ahead of it. She looked at her biscuit. And if he does, then I'll deal with that too, he said. There ain't a court in this territory that will uphold a contract for a person. Amos knows that. He knew it before I burned the paper. The contract was a bully's instrument, not a legal one. Carl knows it too. Carl let it get this far, she said. Carl lets a lot of things get as far as they can go before he has to take a side, Silas said. It ain't admirable, but it's what he does. Last night he took a side. I'll work with what I've got. She nodded. She looked at her hands on the table, both of them visible, not hidden, resting on the plain wood surface in the morning light. And she made a decision of the quiet kind, the kind that does not announce itself. I need to settle something in my own mind, she said, before you go. He waited. He was good at waiting. I am not angry at my uncle, she said slowly, feeling the truth of it as she said it, testing it the way you test ice 1 foot at a time. I have been for a long time. But what he did selling me off like a line in a ledger that came from a man who never learned any way to see people except as costs and returns. He's not going to learn it now. She paused. I can't carry the weight of what he is. It's too heavy, and it ain't mine to carry. She looked up. So I'm putting it down. Silas was looking at her with an expression she had seen fragments of over 5 days, but never all at once, all the pieces assembled. It was not pity, she was sure of that. It was something more like recognition, the look of a man who has arrived at the same place by a different road, and is surprised to find someone already there. That's a hard thing to do, he said. Yes, she said. But I've been doing hard things my whole life. I reckon I can choose which ones are worth the effort. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at his coffee, and then he said quietly to the cup, I ain't an easy man to live alongside. I expect you know that by now. I know it, she said. I got bad nights. More of them than not. I know that too. I can't promise they'll get better. She looked at him steadily. Silas, I grew up in a house where I was a liability. I have been treated as a burden, a body, a mouth to feed a deed to 40 acres. I know the difference between a man who can't promise easy and a man who means harm. She paused. You are not a man who means harm. He was quiet. The fire ticked in the stove. Gretchen, he said, and his voice had changed. Register lower and more careful, the voice of a man approaching something he does not want to damage by rushing it. He set his coffee cup down and turned it once in his hands and set it down again. I got 160 acres on this ridge, good timber, decent pasture once the south field is cleared. The cabin wants work, but the bones are sound. He paused. I have been alone up here for 3 years. I arranged it that way because I thought a man like me, a man with what I carry, I thought it was the decent thing to keep my damage to myself. She did not speak. But I have had 5 days of what this place is like when it ain't just me in it, he said, and I ain't willing to go back to what it was before. She felt the words settle into her the way warmth settles from the outside in reaching the places that had been cold longest last. I ain't asking you to stay out of gratitude, he said. I burned that contract because it was the right thing to do regardless. What I'm asking now is a different question. He looked up and met her eyes and did not look away. Gretchen, will you stay? Not a command, not a transaction. 4 words with a question mark at the end, offered in the voice of a man who is genuinely prepared to hear either answer and has asked anyway because some things are worth the risk of the answer. She looked at him across the plain table with its 2 coffee cups and the biscuit board between them, this big, quiet, damaged man with his scar and his bad nights and his 160 acres and his carved pine shoe support and his outstretched open hand in the snow. And she thought about the kitchen she had left 6 days ago with its 11 jars of plum jam on the windowsill, and how she had stood there and believed briefly that today might be different. It was different. It was in fact entirely new. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his, her rough, red-knuckled hand on his scarred and calloused one, and she felt him go very still at the contact, and then slowly, not grabbing, not gripping, turn his hand over, so that his palm was up and her hand was resting in it. Yes, she said. He closed his fingers around her hand, gently the way you close your hand around something you intend to keep. They sat like that for a while, in the morning light, with the fire going, and the coffee cooling, and the snow outside the window, beginning to show the first faint signs of the melt that was still weeks away, but was already somewhere in the quality of the light, making its intentions known. He rode to Oakhaven that afternoon. She stayed at the cabin and cleaned it from corner to corner, not because it was dirty, but because cleaning was what her hands knew how to do when her mind was working, and her mind had a great deal to work through. She swept the floor and wiped down the shelves and reorganized the stores so she could see clearly what they had and what they would need. And she made a list in her head of seeds for spring and what the south field might grow if it was cleared by April. And she thought about what it would mean to plant a garden in ground that was hers to plant in. And she had to stop and stand at the window for a moment with that thought, because it was almost too large to hold all at once. He came back in the late afternoon with his saddlebag heavier than when he had left. He had spoken to Hodge, who had confirmed that no further complaint had been filed, and that Amos Briggs had ridden out of Oakhaven that morning in the direction of his property on Kettle Creek and had not come back. He had also spoken to the circuit preacher, who happened to be in town and who would be at the church in Oakhaven on Sunday. He said this last part without emphasis, setting it on the table between them. The way he set things down, not pushing, not performing, just placing it where she could see it and decide what she thought of it. She thought about it for a moment. "Sunday," she said. "Day after tomorrow," he said. She looked at him. "You move fast for a man who spent 3 years alone on a ridge." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was what a smile looked like on a face that had forgotten how and was remembering. "I move fast when I know what I want," he said. "I spent 4 years not knowing what I wanted. I reckon I'm making up time." She looked at the window at the late light coming gold and long across the snow. She thought about her mother's church in the town, where she had grown up before the fever year, the whitewashed walls, and the smell of candle wax and pine, the plain wooden pews. She thought about the kind of faith that had gotten her through the years with Clem. Not a loud faith, not a faith that made speeches, but a quiet, persistent faith that there was something in the order of things that was not Clem's accounting, that kept a different ledger that did not reduce a person to what they cost. "All right," she said. "Sunday." He nodded once. Then he opened the saddlebag and took out what he had brought from town, and she saw flour and sugar and a paper of dried currants, and a tin of baking powder and a twist of cinnamon, and at the bottom of the bag, wrapped in cloth, a small jar. She took the jar and unwrapped it and looked at it. Plum jam, dark and dense, and the deep red-purple color of October. On the lid in handwriting she recognized as her own, a strip of paper marked with the batch number and the date. One of the 11 jars from the Mueller kitchen. One of the jars she had made in the last quiet morning of her old life. She looked at him. "Ed Pettifer had them," he said. "Your uncle sold them to the store before he left town. I bought the one back." A pause. "I can go back for the others if you want them." She held the jar in both hands and looked at it for a long time. She thought about the morning she had made it, the cold kitchen, and the dying fire, and the smell of sugar and the 11 jars on the windowsill, like a small and honest hope. She thought about how she had stood there, and believed that if she could just make herself useful enough, take up little enough space, cost little enough, she might be allowed to stay. She had been making the wrong argument to the wrong audience her whole life. "Leave the others," she said. "This one is enough." She set it on the shelf above the stove in the center where the light would catch it. Sunday came with the sky the color of good china blue and clean and cold, and they rode down to Oakhaven on Buck with her in front and his arms on either side of her holding the reins, and the snow on the valley road was packed hard, and the horses' breath made long trails behind them. The pines on the ridge were dark green against the white, and the air smelled of cold and pine resin, and the particular cleanness of a winter morning that intends to be a good day. The church in Oakhaven was not large, whitewashed boards, and a plain cross above the door, and the circuit preacher was a small, tidy man named Aldous Crane, who had the practical manner of a man who has performed ceremonies in barns and courthouses, and once, he mentioned, on a riverboat, and who did not consider the absence of a congregation or flowers or any other customary decoration to be a material defect in the proceedings. There was a congregation, as it turned out, small but present. Ed Pettifer and his wife, who was a round-faced woman with kind eyes and an opinion about everything, had come, and Mrs. Pettifer had brought 2 other women from the town, whose names Gretchen learned were Clara Hess and Ruth Danforth. And they had between them produced a small bunch of dried lavender tied with a ribbon, which Mrs. Pettifer pressed into Gretchen's hands at the door with the firmness of a woman who has decided something and is not interested in discussion. Sheriff Carl Hodge was there too, in the back pew, hat in his lap, looking at the floor in the manner of a man performing penance by attendance. The ceremony was brief and plain and sufficient. Preacher Crane asked the questions, and they gave the answers, her voice steady, his voice steady, and when it was done, he pronounced them. In the eyes of God, and the territory of Kansas, a married pair, and Silas took her hand in his, her rough, work-scarred hand in his larger, rougher one, and held it without letting go. Mrs. Pettifer cried, which she apparently considered a personal service. She provided at all weddings, regardless of the depth of her acquaintance with the parties involved and Ed. Pettifer shook Silas's free hand and said he was glad to see it, and Clara Hess told Gretchen that her brown dress was very becoming, which was not true, but was kind. And Ruth Danforth said nothing, but pressed Gretchen's arm briefly as she passed a small, warm pressure that said more than words would have. Hodge came last. He held his hat. He looked at Gretchen first, and then at Silas, and then back at Gretchen. "I owe you an apology," he said to her directly, without preamble. "I should have looked harder at what that contract was before I let it get where it got." She looked at him steadily. "Yes?" she said. "You should have." He nodded, accepting this. "I'm sorry for it." She thought about the jar on the shelf at the cabin, and the decision she had made at the kitchen table 3 mornings ago, and the weight she had set down and intended to leave on the ground. "I accept your apology, Sheriff," she said. He put his hat back on and went out, and she thought that was probably the most either of them was going to get from that particular account, and that it was, in fact, enough. They rode back to the ridge in the afternoon light, which had gone gold and long and was doing extraordinary things to the snow on the south field, turning it the color of honey at the edges, where it met the shadow of the tree line. She looked at the south field as they passed it, and thought about what it would be in May turned and planted. And the thought was so ordinary and so large at the same time that she had to look at it sideways, the way you look at bright things. Spring came the way it always comes on a Kansas ridge, not gently, not in the soft watercolor way of paintings, but in a determined and somewhat chaotic fashion. The snow pulling back in patches and the mud coming up assertive and black, and smelling of everything that had been sleeping under the cold since November. The creek ran high and brown with snowmelt. The chickens recovered their opinions. The south field showed itself to be exactly what she had estimated from the window, good, dark soil worth the clearing. They cleared it together through March and into April. She and Silas, working in sections, her handling the lighter brush and the seed preparation, while he took the heavier timber, and on the days when his back gave him trouble from an old injury, she did not ask about. She worked the ground with the hand cultivator, and he sat on the fence and directed, which she allowed because it gave him something useful to do, and because his directions were generally correct. The bad nights came and went. She did not try to fix them, and he did not try to hide them. And in this way they became a known feature of the landscape, like the way the north wall lost heat in hard, cold, something to be managed with appropriate tools rather than solved. On the worst nights she sang quietly to herself as much as to him, the old German hymns her mother had left her, and the sound of them in the dark cabin was neither a cure nor a pretense, but simply a presence, one voice saying, "I am here, and the night is finite, and morning is a true thing." He brought her the rest of the plum jam jars in April, all 10 of them, riding back from Oakhaven, with the saddlebag full and the careful expression of a man transporting something fragile. She did not ask what he had paid Ed Pettifer for them. She set them on the shelf above the stove in a row, her 11 jars, and they stood there in the afternoon light like the small and honest hope they had always been returned to the person they had always belonged to. On a morning in early May, when the south field had been turned and the first seeds were in the ground, and the wildflowers had come up along the creek bank, in the particular reckless abundance they always managed. After a hard winter, she was at the kitchen window with her hands in bread dough, working it in the slow, rhythmic way that did not require her full attention and left the rest of her free to look out at the field and the flowers and the ridge above them, with its dark pines and its clear sky. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of his boots on the porch boards, the particular sound of his step that she had learned without trying to learn it, the way you learn the sounds of a place you have decided to stay in. He came through the door and pushed his hat back on his head and looked at her, and then at the bread, and then at the window, and then, as he always did when he came in from the field in the morning and found her at the window, he came to stand beside her and look out at what she was looking at. The field was dark and damp and full of promise. The wild flowers along the creek were yellow and white, and a particular bright blue she had no name for. The ridge above it all was the deep green of late spring pines, against a sky that had decided finally to be warm. His hand, broad and scarred and calloused and capable, settled on her shoulder. Not heavy, not demanding, simply there, the way a thing rests when it has found where it belongs. She pressed her flour-dusted hand over his and felt his fingers close around hers. And outside the window, the field they had planted together lay open to the light, patient, and full of everything that was going to grow.